The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Catherine sat in the morning room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. The newspaper lay folded beside her, its headlines screaming about another royal controversy that seemed to follow the family like a persistent shadow. She had learned to tune out most of the noise over the years, but, lately, the pressure felt different, more personal, more targeted. William had left early that morning for a series of engagements in Scotland, leaving her alone with the children and the mounting tension that seemed to permeate every corner of their lives. The house felt unusually quiet, save for the distant sounds of George, Charlotte, and Louis playing in the nursery upstairs under the watchful eye of their nanny. Catherine's phone buzzed against the mahogany table, displaying yet another message from her private secretary about the ongoing situation. The past few weeks had been particularly challenging, with whispers and rumors circulating through the palace corridors like wildfire. Staff members exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking, and even the most loyal household members seemed on edge. The root of the problem was becoming increasingly clear, though no one dared speak it aloud. The dynamics within the royal family had shifted dramatically since the Queen's passing, and the new hierarchy was still finding its footing. Charles, now firmly established as king, was navigating the delicate balance of maintaining family unity while establishing his own vision for the monarchy. But, beneath the surface, old tensions were bubbling up with renewed intensity. Camilla had always been a complex figure in Catherine's life. Their relationship had been cordial, even warm at times, but there was an undercurrent of something that Catherine could never quite identify. It wasn't jealousy exactly, though that element certainly existed. It was more like a territorial instinct, a subtle but persistent assertion of dominance that made itself known in small ways. The way Camilla would interrupt conversations, the slight dismissiveness in her tone when addressing Catherine directly, the way she seemed to position herself as the ultimate authority on royal protocol and tradition. The morning had started like any other, with Catherine reviewing her upcoming schedule and responding to correspondence. But, as the hours wore on, she found herself increasingly distracted by a growing sense of unease. There had been whispers among the staff about a heated discussion that had taken place the previous evening between Charles and Camilla, though the details remained frustratingly vague. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had served the family for over 2 decades, had been the one to hint at the trouble brewing. Her usually composed demeanor had been replaced by nervous energy as she went about her duties, and Catherine had noticed the way she glanced anxiously toward the king's private quarters whenever she thought no one was watching. The afternoon brought an unexpected summons to Clarence House, where Charles and Camilla maintained their primary residence. The message had come through official channels, couched in formal language about a family consultation, but Catherine could read between the lines. Something significant was happening, and her presence was required. As her car made its way through the London streets, Catherine found herself reflecting on the events that had led to this moment. The past month had been particularly trying, with several incidents that had tested the family's unity. There had been the disagreement over Charlotte's education, with Camilla insisting on a more traditional approach while Catherine advocated for a more modern curriculum. Then, there was the matter of Louis's upcoming birthday celebration, where Camilla had attempted to override Catherine's carefully planned arrangements in favor of something more elaborate and formal. But, perhaps most troubling had been the gradual erosion of Catherine's influence within the family structure. Decisions that had once been made collaboratively were increasingly being made without her input, and she found herself learning about family matters through official channels rather than direct communication. It was a subtle but unmistakable shift that spoke to larger power struggles within the monarchy. The car pulled up to the familiar entrance of Clarence House, where Catherine was greeted by the usual complement of security personnel and household staff. The atmosphere felt different somehow, more charged, more tense than usual. Even the normally chatty doorman offered only a brief nod as she made her way inside. Catherine was escorted to the blue drawing room, where she was told to wait for the king and queen consort. The room, with its pale blue silk wall coverings and carefully curated collection of antiques, had always struck her as particularly formal and somewhat cold. Today, it seemed to reflect the mood of the entire household. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness as Catherine sat alone, her mind racing through possible scenarios and explanations for this sudden summons. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing moment with methodical precision, its steady rhythm the only sound in the otherwise silent room. When Charles finally arrived, he was alone, a fact that immediately caught Catherine's attention. The king looked tired, older somehow than he had just weeks earlier, and there was a gravity to his expression that she had rarely seen outside of the most serious state occasions. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken concerns. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." She rose to greet him, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he gestured for her to sit. "Of course, Your Majesty. Is everything all right?" Charles took a seat across from her, his usually impeccable posture betraying signs of the stress he was clearly under. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with how to begin, his eyes focusing on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder as he gathered his thoughts. "There have been some developments," he said finally, his voice careful and measured. "Matters that require careful consideration and, I'm afraid, some difficult conversations." Catherine felt her heart rate quicken as she waited for him to continue. The formal tone, the careful choice of words, the obvious reluctance to proceed, all of it pointed to something significant and potentially life-changing. "It has come to my attention," Charles continued, "that there have been certain irregularities in how family matters have been handled recently. Decisions made without proper consultation, protocols bypassed, and, perhaps most concerning, deliberate attempts to undermine established relationships within our family structure." The words hung in the air between them, their implications slowly sinking in. Catherine found herself holding her breath, afraid to speak lest she break whatever spell was allowing Charles to voice these concerns so directly. "I want you to know," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers, "that I am aware of the challenges you have faced. The subtle discouragements, the bureaucratic obstacles, the way your voice has been marginalized in recent months. None of this has gone unnoticed, and none of it represents the values or vision I have for this family." Catherine felt a surge of emotion, relief, gratitude, and something approaching vindication. For months, she had wondered if she was imagining the subtle slights and growing isolation. To hear Charles acknowledge these issues so directly was both validating and deeply moving. "Your Majesty," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please, let me finish," he said gently. "There are things that need to be said, truths that need to be acknowledged, and I fear I have allowed certain situations to persist far longer than I should have." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside caused both of them to tense slightly. Charles glanced toward the door, his expression hardening in a way that Catherine had never seen before. The footsteps paused outside the drawing room, and for a moment, Catherine could have sworn she heard whispered voices, though the words were indistinct. "What I am about to tell you," Charles said, lowering his voice slightly, "must remain between us until I determine the appropriate time and manner to address these issues more broadly. But I wanted you to hear it from me first, and I wanted you to know that you have my complete support and confidence." Catherine nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The gravity of the moment was not lost on her. This was clearly a pivotal point in the family's dynamics, and Charles was preparing to take a stand that would have far-reaching consequences. "The Queen Consort," Charles began, then paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Camilla has been operating under the assumption that her position grants her certain authorities and privileges that extend beyond what is appropriate or acceptable. She has made decisions regarding family matters, palace operations, and even your children's lives without consultation or consideration for established protocols." Catherine felt her stomach drop as the full implications of his words became clear. The subtle undermining she had experienced wasn't imagined or coincidental. It had been systematic and deliberate. "Furthermore," Charles continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "she has actively worked to isolate you from family discussions and decisions, apparently believing that your influence represents some kind of threat to her own position. This behavior is not only inappropriate, but actively harmful to the unity and effectiveness of our family." The door to the drawing room suddenly opened without warning, and Camilla strode in with the confident bearing that had become her trademark. She was impeccably dressed as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, but there was something in her expression that immediately put Catherine on alert. "Charles," Camilla said, her voice carrying a note of authority that seemed to fill the room. "I wasn't aware you were meeting with Catherine today. Surely any family discussions should include all relevant parties." The tension in the room became palpable as Charles slowly rose from his chair, his expression transforming from the gentle concern he had shown Catherine to something much more formidable. Catherine had witnessed Charles in various moods and circumstances over the years, but She had never seen him look quite so resolute and, frankly, intimidating. "Camilla," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Actually, your arrival is quite timely. There are matters we need to discuss." Camilla's confident demeanor faltered slightly as she registered the tone in Charles's voice. She glanced between him and Catherine, clearly trying to assess the situation and determine what had transpired in her absence. "Of course," she said, settling into a chair with studied casualness. "What matters would those be?" Charles remained standing, a position that gave him both physical and psychological advantage in the room. Catherine found herself holding her breath as she watched the careful dance of power and position playing out before her. "The matters," Charles said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "of respect, protocol, and the fundamental principles upon which this family operates. The matters of boundaries, authority, and the proper channels through which decisions are made. And, most importantly, the matter of how we treat the people we are supposed to support and protect." Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, and Catherine could see the wheels turning as she processed what Charles was really saying. The room felt charged with electricity, as if lightning might strike at any moment. "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to," Camilla said carefully, though her body language suggested she understood perfectly well. Charles moved to the window, gazing out at the garden beyond before turning back to face both women. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of his position and authority. "Then, allow me to be perfectly clear," he said. "It has come to my attention that you have been systematically undermining Catherine's position within this family, making decisions that affect her and her children without consultation, and generally conducting yourself as if you hold authorities and privileges that you simply do not possess." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Catherine found herself fascinated by the transformation she was witnessing in Charles. This was not the sometimes hesitant, diplomatic figure she knew from public appearances. This was a man who had finally reached his limit and was prepared to take action. Camilla's carefully controlled mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and defensive beneath. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "I think there may be some misunderstanding," she began, but Charles cut her off with a gesture. "There is no misunderstanding," he said firmly. "There is only a pattern of behavior that ends today." The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its sonorous tones echoing through the suddenly silent room. Catherine realized she was witnessing a moment that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their family, and possibly the monarchy itself. The carefully maintained equilibrium that had existed since Charles's coronation was about to be shattered, and there would be no going back. Charles returned to his seat, but his posture remained formal and commanding. When he looked at Camilla, there was no trace of the usual warmth or indulgence that typically characterized their interactions. "From this moment forward," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal decree, "all matters affecting Catherine, William, and their children will be discussed with and decided by them directly. Any attempts to circumvent this process or to make unilateral decisions affecting their lives will be considered a direct challenge to my authority and will be dealt with accordingly." Camilla's face had gone pale, and Catherine could see her struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. The woman who had seemed so confident and assured just minutes earlier now appeared uncertain and somewhat lost. "Charles," Camilla said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "surely we can discuss this privately." "There's no need to. There is every need," Charles interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This conversation is long overdue, and Catherine deserves to hear these things said directly and unambiguously." Catherine felt a mix of emotions wash over her: gratitude, relief, and a growing sense that justice was finally being served. For so long, she had felt isolated and increasingly powerless within the family structure. To see Charles take such a firm stand on her behalf was both moving and empowering. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the drawing room's elegant carpet. The three of them sat in a triangle of tension, each processing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Catherine knew that this moment would be remembered and discussed for years to come, a turning point in the family's history that would reshape relationships and power dynamics in ways that were only beginning to become clear. As the silence stretched on, Catherine found herself thinking about William and the children, wondering how this confrontation would ultimately affect their lives. She thought about the countless small slights and frustrations that had led to this moment, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Charles for finally addressing issues that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The drawing room, with its formal furniture and royal portraits gazing down from the walls, seemed to hold its breath as the three most powerful people in the modern British monarchy sat in contemplation of what would come next. The old order was crumbling, and something new was about to take its place. The silence that followed Charles's declaration stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Catherine watched as Camilla's hands tightened on the arms of her chair, knuckles white against the burgundy fabric. The queen consort's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the frustration and anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. "You cannot be serious," Camilla finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a dangerous edge. "After everything we've built together, everything we've accomplished, you're going to let her drive a wedge between us?" Charles's expression didn't waver as he regarded his wife with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "This isn't about choosing sides, Camilla. This is about maintaining the standards of respect and collaboration that should define our family. Catherine hasn't driven any wedges. Your actions have created the divisions we're dealing with today." Catherine felt the weight of being discussed as if she weren't in the room, but she also recognized the importance of allowing Charles to address these issues directly with his wife. This conversation had been years in the making, and she sensed that any intervention on her part might derail the momentum Charles had finally gathered. Camilla rose abruptly from her chair, beginning to pace near the fireplace with agitated steps. Her usual grace seemed to abandon her as she struggled to process this unexpected challenge to her authority. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, her voice rising slightly, "to constantly be compared to someone who's been elevated to saint status, to have every decision questioned and every action scrutinized." "Saint status?" Charles repeated, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Catherine is a dedicated member of this family who has served with distinction for over a decade. If you feel threatened by her competence and popularity, that says more about your own insecurities than it does about any supposed favoritism." The words hung in the air like physical blows, and Catherine could see their impact on Camilla's face. The queen consort stopped pacing and turned to face Charles directly, her eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Insecurities?" Camilla's voice was dangerously quiet now. "Is that what you think this is about? After all the years I stood by you, after all the sacrifices I made, after enduring decades of public hatred and criticism, you think I'm simply insecure about a woman who had everything handed to her on a silver platter?" Catherine felt a flush of indignation at the characterization, but forced herself to remain silent. She had learned over the years that Camilla's version of history often differed significantly from reality, particularly when it came to the challenges and sacrifices each of them had made for the family. Charles stood up slowly, his full height, and bearing emphasizing his authority in the room. "Your sacrifices and dedication are acknowledged and appreciated," he said formally. "But they do not give you license to undermine other members of this family or to operate outside the established protocols that govern our relationships." "Protocols?" Camilla laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about protocols? What protocol allows her to have private audiences with you to discuss family matters without the queen consort present? What protocol gives her the right to make decisions about royal engagements and public appearances that affect the entire family?" Catherine realized with growing alarm that Camilla's accusations were revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of her role and responsibilities. The queen consort seemed to view every interaction between Charles and Catherine as some kind of conspiracy against her authority. "Catherine is the Princess of Wales," Charles said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "She is the wife of my heir and the mother of the future king. Her position grants her certain rights and responsibilities that exist independently of your approval or oversight. The fact that you seem to view these legitimate roles as encroachments on your territory is exactly the problem we need to address." Camilla's face flushed red with anger, and Catherine could see her struggling to maintain even a semblance of royal composure. "My territory? This is about the stability and unity of the monarchy, Charles. When decisions are made without proper consultation, when protocols are ignored in favor of personal preferences, it undermines the entire institution." "The only thing undermining this institution," Charles replied, his voice rising for the first time, "is your persistent attempts to control and marginalize Catherine. The unnecessary obstacles you place in her way, The deliberate exclusion from family discussions, the constant second-guessing of her decisions regarding her own children. None of this serves the monarchy or the family. Catherine watched this exchange with fascination and growing relief. For so long, she had wondered if she was imagining the subtle hostilities and deliberate obstacles that seemed to characterize her interactions with Camilla. To hear Charles articulate these issues so clearly and decisively was both validating and empowering. The sound of rain against the windows seemed to intensify as the afternoon wore on, creating a backdrop of atmospheric tension that matched the mood in the drawing room. Catherine found herself thinking about William, wondering if he had any sense of the dramatic confrontation unfolding in his absence. "You want to know what I think?" Camilla said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I think you've been manipulated by someone who knows exactly how to present herself as the perfect victim. Someone who smiles prettily and says all the right things while systematically working to isolate me from my husband and undermine my position in this family." Catherine felt her own composure beginning to slip as Camilla's accusations became more personal and pointed. The suggestion that she was some kind of manipulative figure was particularly galling, given the years of patience and diplomacy she had exercised in dealing with these very issues. "Camilla," Charles said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "you are crossing lines that should not be crossed. Catherine has conducted herself with nothing but grace and professionalism throughout her time in this family. If you cannot acknowledge that basic truth, then we have even bigger problems than I realized." "Grace and professionalism," Camilla repeated mockingly. "Yes, she's very good at that, isn't she? Very good at making everyone else look unreasonable or petty by comparison. Very good at positioning herself as the innocent party while ensuring that any criticism of her behavior reflects poorly on the critic." Catherine finally felt compelled to speak, though she kept her voice carefully controlled. "Camilla, I have never tried to undermine your position or create conflict within this family. If my presence or actions have made you feel threatened, I'm sorry for that. But I cannot accept responsibility for feelings that seem to be based on misunderstandings of my role and intentions." Camilla turned to face Catherine directly for the first time since the conversation began, her eyes blazing with years of accumulated resentment. "Misunderstandings? Is that what we're calling it when you go around me to make decisions about family events? When you change arrangements I've made without consulting me? When you act as if my position and authority mean nothing?" "I have never acted outside my proper role," Catherine replied firmly. "When I've made decisions about events involving my children or my royal duties, I've done so within the appropriate channels and with proper consultation. If you feel excluded from those processes, perhaps we should examine whether your involvement was actually necessary or appropriate." The exchange was becoming increasingly heated, and Catherine could see Charles watching both women with a mixture of concern and determination. She sensed that this moment represented a crucial test of his leadership and his ability to manage the complex dynamics within his family. Necessary or appropriate? Camilla's voice was incredulous. "I am the queen consort of this realm. Everything that happens within this family is my concern, and every decision should be made with my knowledge and input. The idea that you can simply decide when my involvement is necessary shows exactly the kind of arrogance and presumption I'm talking about." Charles stepped forward, placing himself physically between the two women in what Catherine recognized as both a protective and authoritative gesture. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of command. "This conversation has revealed exactly what I suspected: fundamental misunderstandings about roles, responsibilities, and the chain of authority within this family." He turned to face Camilla directly, his expression serious and unyielding. "You are the queen consort, and that position comes with significant honors, privileges, and responsibilities. But it does not make you the supreme authority over every aspect of family life, particularly when it comes to matters involving other senior members of the royal family." Camilla's mouth opened as if to protest, but Charles continued before she could speak. "Catherine is not your subordinate, and her children are not subject to your oversight. William and Catherine have the right and responsibility to make decisions about their family life, their public duties, and their children's upbringing without requiring your approval or permission." The words seemed to hit Camilla like physical blows, and Catherine could see the shock and hurt registering on her face. For years, she had apparently operated under the assumption that her position as queen consort gave her broad authority over family matters, and This direct challenge to that understanding was clearly devastating. "So that's it then?" Camilla said, her voice becoming thin and strained. "After everything we've been through together, after all the support I've given you, and this family, you're going to choose her over me?" Charles's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "This isn't about choosing anyone over anyone else. This is about establishing clear boundaries and ensuring that everyone in this family can function effectively within their proper roles. Your marriage to me doesn't give you veto power over Catherine's life or William's decisions." Catherine felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched this exchange. There was satisfaction in seeing Charles finally address issues that had been problematic for years, but there was also genuine sadness at witnessing the pain and confusion on Camilla's face. Despite their conflicts, Catherine had never wanted to see the queen consort completely humiliated or isolated. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking the passage of another hour in what was clearly becoming one of the most significant conversations in the recent history of the royal family. Catherine realized that the outcomes of this confrontation would likely reshape relationships and power dynamics for years to come. "I think," Catherine said carefully, "that we all want the same thing: a strong, united royal family that serves the public effectively and maintains the dignity of the institution. Perhaps we can find a way forward that respects everyone's position while ensuring clear communication and appropriate boundaries." Camilla looked at Catherine with an expression that mixed surprise and suspicion. "And what would that look like exactly? What kind of arrangement would satisfy your requirements while still acknowledging my position and authority?" Catherine glanced at Charles, who nodded encouragingly. "I think it would involve clear definitions of our respective roles and responsibilities," she said. "Regular communication about matters that affect the family as a whole, but respect for individual authority within our own areas of responsibility. And, most importantly, a commitment from everyone to support each other rather than working at cross purposes." "Support each other," Camilla repeated thoughtfully. "That sounds lovely in theory, but what does it mean in practice? What happens when our views conflict? What happens when decisions need to be made quickly? Who has the final authority?" Charles stepped in to address these questions. "The final authority depends on the matter at hand," he said. "Issues involving the children's education, health, or personal development belong to William and Catherine. Matters of state protocol and official ceremonies fall under established palace procedures. Questions of family unity and major decisions affecting the monarchy as a whole come to me." Camilla was silent for a long moment, clearly processing these guidelines and their implications for her role going forward. Catherine could see her struggling with the reduction in the broad authority she had apparently assumed was hers by right. "And what about matters that fall between these categories?" Camilla asked. "What about decisions that affect multiple people or areas of responsibility? What about situations where quick action is needed and all the relevant parties can't be consulted?" "Those situations require communication and collaboration," Charles replied. "They require the kind of mature, respectful dialogue that should characterize all our interactions. They require putting the good of the family and the institution above personal preferences or territorial concerns." Catherine sensed that they were approaching a crucial moment in this conversation. The parameters were being established, the expectations were being clarified, and the question now was whether Camilla would accept these new realities or continue to resist them. The rain outside had intensified into a proper storm, with thunder rumbling in the distance and lightning occasionally illuminating the drawing room in stark relief. The weather seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence playing out within the walls of Clarence's house. "I need to understand something," Camilla said suddenly, her voice taking on a different quality, less defensive, more searching. "Are you saying that my attempts to be involved in family decisions, my efforts to maintain standards and protocols, have been inappropriate? Are you suggesting that I should simply step back and allow others to make decisions that affect our entire family without any input from me?" Charles considered this question carefully before responding. "I'm saying that your efforts to control and override other family members' legitimate authority have been inappropriate. I'm suggesting that you should focus on your own considerable responsibilities and trust other family members to handle their areas of authority competently." "But what if I disagree with their decisions?" Camilla pressed. "What if I think they're making mistakes that will reflect poorly on all of us? Am I supposed to simply stand by and say nothing?" "You're supposed to express your concerns through appropriate channels and with appropriate respect," Catherine interjected. You're supposed to trust that other adults in this family are capable of making good decisions about their own lives and responsibilities. And you're supposed to support the family publicly while working out any disagreements privately and constructively. Camilla stared at Catherine for a long moment, and Catherine could see something shifting in her expression. The anger and defensiveness were still there, but there was also a dawning recognition of the validity of what was being said. "This is difficult for me," Camilla admitted finally. "I've spent so many years fighting for my place in this family, fighting to be taken seriously and respected. The idea of stepping back, of trusting others to make decisions that affect us all, it goes against every instinct I've developed." Charles moved closer to his wife, his expression softening with understanding. "I know it's difficult," he said gently, "but your place in this family is secure. Your value and contributions are recognized. What we're asking for is a shift in approach, not a diminishment of your importance." Catherine felt a moment of hope that they might actually work through these issues constructively. She could see the pain and vulnerability beneath Camilla's defensive exterior, and she recognized that much of the conflict had stemmed from insecurity rather than malice. "Perhaps," Catherine suggested, "we could establish regular family meetings where everyone can share concerns and discuss upcoming decisions together. That would ensure communication and collaboration while still respecting individual areas of authority." Camilla looked thoughtful at this suggestion. "Regular meetings might help," she agreed slowly, "but only if they're genuine consultations and not simply opportunities for you to inform me about decisions that have already been made." "They would be genuine," Catherine assured her. "The goal would be to prevent misunderstandings and ensure that everyone feels heard and respected." Charles nodded approvingly at this exchange. "I think that's an excellent starting point," he said. "Regular family consultations, clear role definitions, and a commitment to respectful communication. These are the foundations we need to build upon." The storm outside was beginning to subside, and Catherine noticed that the atmosphere in the room seemed to be shifting as well. The confrontational tension was giving way to something more constructive, though she sensed that the real test would come in the implementation of whatever agreements they reached today. "There's something else we need to address," Charles said, his tone becoming more serious again. "The pattern of subtle undermining and deliberate obstacles that have characterized recent months cannot continue. Catherine, William, and the children deserve to function within this family without constantly having to navigate unnecessary complications or justify their legitimate decisions." Camilla's jaw tightened slightly at this reminder of the issues that had triggered this confrontation. "And if I have genuine concerns about decisions being made, if I truly believe something is not in the family's best interest, then you raise those concerns directly, respectfully, and through proper channels," Charles replied firmly. "You don't create obstacles or work behind the scenes to undermine decisions that have already been made. You don't exclude people from discussions that affect them, and you don't attempt to override their authority in areas where they have legitimate autonomy." Catherine could see that they were approaching the heart of the matter, the behavioral changes that would need to occur for this new understanding to work. Words and agreements were one thing, but actual changes in behavior and attitude would be the true test of whether this confrontation would lead to genuine improvement in their relationships. As the afternoon continued to unfold, Catherine realized that this conversation would mark a turning point not just in her relationship with Camilla, but in the entire dynamic of the royal family under Charles's leadership. The king had chosen to address long-standing issues directly and decisively, setting a precedent for how conflicts would be handled going forward. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, marking the passage of time as three of the most powerful people in Britain worked to reshape the foundations of their family relationships. Outside, the storm was passing, but inside Clarence's house, the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. The tension in the drawing room had shifted but not entirely dissipated. Catherine could sense that while progress had been made, the most difficult moments of this confrontation were yet to come. Camilla sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Charles maintained his position near the window, his silhouette framed against the gray afternoon sky. "I want to be clear about something," Camilla said suddenly, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. "I have never acted with malicious intent toward Catherine or her family. Every decision I've made, every action I've taken, has been with the best interests of the monarchy in mind." Catherine felt a flash of frustration at this characterization. The road to dysfunction was often paved with good intentions, but that didn't excuse the impact of harmful behavior. She chose her words carefully as she responded. I don't question your intentions, Camilla, she said diplomatically. But intent and impact are two different things. Regardless of what you meant to accomplish, the effect of many of your actions has been to create confusion, conflict, and unnecessary stress within our family. Camilla's eyes flashed with something approaching anger. Unnecessary stress? You have no idea what real stress looks like. You have no idea what it means to be constantly scrutinized, constantly questioned, constantly compared to an impossible standard. You walked into this family with universal approval and public adoration. I fought for every ounce of acceptance I've ever received. The words seemed to burst out of Camilla like water from a broken dam, revealing depths of resentment and pain that had clearly been accumulating for years. Catherine found herself feeling an unexpected moment of sympathy for the queen consort, even as she recognized the unfairness of the comparison. You're right, Catherine said quietly. Our experiences have been very different. The public reception, the media coverage, the path to acceptance, none of that has been the same for us. But that doesn't change the fact that we both have roles to play in this family, and those roles need to complement rather than compete with each other. Charles stepped forward, his expression serious. Camilla, your journey to acceptance has been long and difficult, and I've watched you handle challenges that would have broken lesser people. But you cannot use those struggles as justification for creating difficulties for other family members. Creating difficulties? Camilla's voice rose sharply. Is that what we're calling my efforts to maintain standards and ensure proper protocols? Is that what we're calling my attempts to provide guidance and oversight to ensure this family functions effectively? We're calling it what it is, Charles replied, his patience clearly beginning to wear thin again. A pattern of interference and control that goes far beyond your legitimate authority. A systematic effort to undermine Catherine's position and influence within this family. Catherine could see Camilla struggling with this direct characterization of her behavior. The queen consort had clearly convinced herself that her actions were appropriate and necessary, and being forced to confront the reality of their impact was obviously difficult. Let me give you some specific examples, Charles continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for difficult diplomatic conversations. The incident last month where you countermanded Catherine's arrangements for Charlotte's birthday party, claiming that the planned activities were inappropriate, and implementing your own agenda without consultation. Camilla's face flushed, but she remained silent as Charles continued his recitation. The meeting 3 weeks ago about the family's Christmas schedule, where you deliberately scheduled the discussion for a time when you knew William and Catherine couldn't attend, then presented the resulting decisions as family consensus despite their absence. Catherine remembered that incident vividly. She and William had learned about major changes to their holiday plans through a formal memorandum from palace staff rather than through direct family communication. It had felt like a deliberate attempt to present them with fait accompli rather than involving them in the decision-making process. The reorganization of staff responsibilities last month, Charles continued, where you attempted to place several of Catherine's personal staff under your direct supervision, effectively reducing her autonomy over her own household management. Those changes were about efficiency, Camilla protested, about eliminating redundancies and creating clearer lines of authority. Those changes were about control, Charles corrected firmly, about inserting yourself into areas where you have no legitimate authority and creating unnecessary complications for people who were already functioning effectively. Catherine watched this exchange with growing amazement at Charles's detailed knowledge of these incidents. She had wondered if he was aware of the systematic nature of the problems she had been experiencing, and clearly he had been paying closer attention than she had realized. And then, there's the matter of the children's education, Charles said, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. Your repeated attempts to override William and Catherine's decisions about George's curriculum, Charlotte's extracurricular activities, and Louis's developmental schedule. These are not matters where the queen consort has any legitimate role, yet you've consistently attempted to insert your authority. Catherine felt a surge of protective anger as Charles mentioned her children. The attempts to control decisions about their education and development had been among the most troubling aspects of her conflicts with Camilla. These were deeply personal family matters that should have been beyond any outside interference. I have experience with royal education, Camilla said defensively. I've seen what works and what doesn't. I was trying to help ensure that the children receive the best possible preparation for their future roles. You have experience with your own children's education, Charles replied sharply. That doesn't give you authority over William and Catherine's children. That doesn't make your preferences more valid than those of the children's actual parents. And it certainly doesn't justify the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering you've employed to try to implement your vision. Catherine could see that Camilla was beginning to realize the full scope of what Charles knew about her actions. The queen consort's confident demeanor was crumbling as she was forced to confront the systematic nature of her interference in family matters. You've been investigating me, Camilla said, her voice a mixture of accusation and hurt. You've been collecting evidence, building a case against me like I'm some kind of criminal. I've been paying attention, Charles replied evenly. I've been listening to concerns that have been raised, observing patterns of behavior, and documenting incidents that affect the harmony and effectiveness of our family. It's not an investigation. It's responsible leadership. Catherine felt a moment of profound gratitude toward Charles for taking this situation seriously enough to pay such close attention to the details. For months, she had felt like she was fighting shadows, unable to pin down exactly what was happening or why she felt increasingly isolated and undermined. To have Charles articulate these patterns so clearly was both validating and empowering. So what happens now? Camilla asked, her voice subdued. What's the endgame here? Are you going to publicly humiliate me? Are you going to strip me of my position and authority? Are you going to turn me into some kind of ceremonial figurehead with no real role in this family? Charles moved to sit down again, his expression softening slightly. What happens now depends entirely on your willingness to acknowledge these issues and commit to changing the behaviors that have created them. No one wants to humiliate you or diminish your legitimate role. But we cannot continue with the status quo. Catherine could see the internal struggle playing out on Camilla's face. The queen consort was clearly grappling with the choice between defending her actions and accepting responsibility for their consequences. It was a moment that would likely define her relationship with the family going forward. I need you to understand something, Camilla said finally, her voice shaking slightly. Everything I've done has been motivated by a desire to protect this institution and ensure its continued success. If my methods have been flawed or my approach has been heavy-handed, it's because I care so deeply about the outcome. Catherine felt a complex mix of emotions at this admission. There was sympathy for Camilla's obvious distress, gratitude for what seemed like a genuine acknowledgement of problematic behavior, and hope that this might represent a turning point toward better relationships. I believe that, Catherine said carefully. I believe that you care deeply about this family and this institution. But caring deeply doesn't excuse harmful actions, and good intentions don't automatically lead to good outcomes. What matters now is whether we can find a way to channel your passion and dedication in directions that support rather than undermine our collective goals. Charles nodded approvingly at Catherine's response. Exactly, he said. The question isn't whether you care or whether your motives are pure. The question is whether you can adjust your approach to work collaboratively rather than unilaterally, to support rather than control, to trust rather than micromanage. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands as she processed these challenges. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. It's difficult, she admitted. After years of having to fight for every bit of respect and authority, it's hard to step back and trust others to make good decisions. It's hard to believe that my input isn't needed or wanted. It's hard to accept that my experience and knowledge might not be valued or relevant. Catherine felt a wave of unexpected empathy for Camilla's struggle. She could imagine how difficult it must be to transition from fighting for recognition to learning how to exercise authority responsibly. The skills needed for survival were often different from those required for effective leadership. Your experience and knowledge are valued, Catherine said gently. But value and relevance don't automatically translate into authority or control. There's a difference between offering advice and making decisions, between providing input and overriding others' choices. And there's a difference, Charles added, between supporting this family and controlling it. We need your support, your wisdom, and your dedication. We don't need your oversight of areas where you lack legitimate authority. The room fell silent again as the three of them contemplated the implications of this conversation. Catherine could see that they were approaching a crucial decision point, whether Camilla would accept these new parameters or continue to resist them. I want to make this work, Camilla said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. But I need to understand exactly what's expected of me, and I need assurance that my legitimate role and authority won't be undermined in the process. Charles leaned forward, his expression earnest. Your legitimate role is significant and important. As queen consort, you have substantial responsibilities in areas of state protocol, ceremonial functions, and public representation. You have a vital role in supporting charitable causes and representing the monarchy at home and abroad. Your voice in family discussions is welcome and valued. But, Catherine continued, understanding where Charles was heading, your role doesn't include authority over other family members' personal decisions, their children's upbringing, or their household management. It doesn't include the right to override decisions made within other people's areas of responsibility. Camilla nodded slowly, though Catherine could see her struggling with these limitations. And what about situations where I genuinely believe someone is making a mistake? Where I think a decision could have negative consequences for the family or the monarchy? You express your concerns directly, respectfully, and through appropriate channels, Charles replied. You present your perspective and trust others to consider it seriously. But you accept that the final decision rests with the people who have legitimate authority in those areas. Even if you think they're wrong? Camilla pressed. Even if you think they're wrong, Charles confirmed. Because the alternative, a system where you have veto power over other family members' decisions, is untenable and ultimately destructive. Catherine could see that this was the heart of the matter for Camilla. The queen consort was struggling with the idea of expressing her views without having the power to enforce them. It was a fundamental shift from control to influence, and clearly a difficult adjustment for someone who had fought so hard to gain authority. This is going to require a significant change in how I approach family matters, Camilla acknowledged. It's going to require me to trust others' judgment even when it conflicts with my own preferences. It's going to require me to support decisions I might not have made myself. Yes, Charles said simply. It is. And it's going to require all of us to communicate more openly, to address conflicts directly rather than allowing them to fester, and to prioritize the good of the family over individual preferences or territorial concerns. Catherine felt a cautious optimism beginning to emerge. While this conversation had been difficult and emotionally charged, it seemed to be moving toward a genuine understanding of the issues and a commitment to addressing them constructively. I'm willing to try, Camilla said, though her voice carried notes of uncertainty and apprehension. I'm willing to adjust my approach and respect these boundaries. But I need assurance that this won't mean I'm marginalized or excluded from important family matters. You won't be marginalized, Catherine assured her. Your voice and perspective are important to this family. The goal isn't to silence you or exclude you. It's to ensure that everyone can function effectively within their proper roles. Charles stood up, moving to the window again as the afternoon light began to fade. This conversation represents a new beginning for our family, he said thoughtfully. It's an opportunity to establish clearer communication, better boundaries, and more effective collaboration. But it only works if everyone commits to the changes we've discussed. Catherine could sense that the formal confrontation was winding down, but she knew that the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead as they attempted to implement these new understandings in their daily interactions. Words were relatively easy. Changing entrenched patterns of behavior would be much more challenging. There's one more thing we need to address, Charles said, turning back to face both women. The public perception of our family unity. Regardless of whatever private disagreements we may have, we must present a united front in our public roles. Any airing of these conflicts in public forums would be damaging to the monarchy and unacceptable to me personally. Camilla and Catherine both nodded their understanding of this expectation. Catherine had never had any intention of making their conflicts public, but she appreciated Charles making this boundary explicit. And that means, Charles continued, that we need to resolve our private disagreements privately and professionally. It means we need to support each other in public even when we might disagree in private. It means we need to protect the dignity and reputation of the monarchy above our personal preferences or grievances. As the day progressed toward evening, Catherine realized that this conversation would mark a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the royal family. The confrontation had been necessary and productive, but the real work of rebuilding relationships and establishing new patterns of interaction was just beginning. The success of these efforts would depend on everyone's willingness to honor the commitments they had made and to prioritize the good of the family over individual desires for control or recognition. As evening approached, the atmosphere in the drawing room had transformed from confrontational to contemplative. The initial anger and defensiveness had given way to a more subdued but intense examination of relationships and responsibilities. Catherine could see that all three of them were emotionally drained by the weight of the conversations and revelations that had unfolded throughout the afternoon. Charles had taken a seat near the fireplace, his usually impeccable posture showing signs of the stress he had been carrying. The fire cast dancing shadows across his face as he spoke, giving his words an almost hypnotic quality. "I want to share something with both of you," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately commanded attention. "Since becoming king, I've had to make many difficult decisions, but few have been as personally challenging as addressing the issues we've discussed today." Catherine felt a tightening in her chest as she recognized the formal tone that often preceded major announcements or decisions. She glanced at Camilla, who had gone very still, clearly sensing the same shift in atmosphere. "The monarchy's strength has always depended on the unity and effectiveness of the royal family," Charles continued. "When that unity is compromised, when family members are working at cross purposes or undermining each other's authority, it weakens the entire institution." Camilla opened her mouth as if to speak, but Charles raised a hand to indicate he wasn't finished. "Over the past several months, I've received reports from multiple sources about tensions within our family. Palace staff, government officials, even foreign dignitaries have commented on apparent discord between senior family members. This is not just a personal matter. It's an institutional crisis that requires decisive action." Catherine's stomach dropped as she began to understand the full scope of what had been happening. The conflicts she thought had been relatively private had apparently been visible to outsiders, which meant the damage extended far beyond their personal relationships. "The situation has reached a point," Charles said, his voice becoming even more serious, "where I can no longer maintain the fiction that these are minor disagreements or personality conflicts. The systematic undermining of Catherine's position, the deliberate creation of obstacles to effective family functioning, the attempts to usurp authority that belongs to other family members, these behaviors threaten the stability of the monarchy itself." Camilla had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair with such intensity that her knuckles were white. "Charles," she began, but he continued speaking. "Therefore, I am implementing immediate changes to how our family operates. These are not suggestions or guidelines. They are directives that will be enforced through formal palace protocols." Catherine felt her heart racing as she anticipated what was coming next. The formal tone, the reference to palace protocols, the emphasis on enforcement, all of it suggested that Charles was about to make changes with far-reaching consequences. "Effective immediately," Charles announced, "all matters involving Catherine, William, and their children will be handled directly through their household, without interference or oversight from the Queen Consort's office. Any attempts to circumvent this directive will be treated as insubordination and dealt with accordingly." Camilla's face went from pale to ashen as the implications of this announcement sank in. Catherine realized that Charles was essentially creating a firewall between Camilla's authority and her family's autonomy, a dramatic step that would formalize the boundaries they had been discussing. "Furthermore," Charles continued, "there will be a formal review of all palace protocols and procedures to ensure that lines of authority are clearly defined and properly respected. This review will be conducted by an independent committee and will result in updated guidelines that all family members will be expected to follow." Catherine could see Camilla struggling to process these developments. The Queen Consort had clearly expected this conversation to remain at the level of family discussion, not escalate to formal institutional changes. "Charles," Camilla said, her voice shaking, "surely this is excessive. Surely we can work out our differences without involving palace bureaucracy and formal protocols. This makes it seem like we're adversaries rather than family members." Charles's expression remained resolute as he responded, "We are family members, but we are also public servants with institutional responsibilities. When family conflicts begin to affect our ability to serve effectively, institutional measures become necessary." Catherine found herself feeling a complex mix of relief and concern. Relief that Charles was taking such decisive action to address the problems, but concern about the potential long-term effects on family relationships. Once formal protocols were involved, it would be much more difficult to rebuild the personal connections that made family gatherings comfortable and natural. "There's something else," Charles said, and Catherine could hear the reluctance in his voice. "I've received advice from constitutional experts and senior government officials about the current situation. Their unanimous opinion is that continued dysfunction within the royal family poses a risk to the stability of the monarchy and, by extension, to the constitutional framework of the realm. The room fell completely silent as the full weight of this statement sank in. Catherine realized that what she had seen as personal conflicts had apparently been viewed by others as threats to the fundamental stability of the British constitutional system. That seems rather dramatic, Camilla said weakly, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. It may seem dramatic, Charles replied, but the monarchy's effectiveness depends on public confidence in our ability to function as a unified institution. When that confidence is shaken by visible discord among senior family members, the entire system is weakened. Catherine felt a growing sense of responsibility for the situation, even though she knew intellectually that she hadn't been the one creating the conflicts. The idea that her personal struggles with Camilla had contributed to constitutional concerns was both overwhelming and sobering. What do the experts recommend? Catherine asked quietly. Charles looked directly at her as he answered. They recommend immediate action to restore family unity, clear definition of roles and responsibilities, and public demonstration of effective collaboration among senior family members. They also recommend consequences for continued dysfunction that would protect the institution even if it means making difficult personal decisions. Camilla's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine fear. What kind of consequences? She asked, her voice barely audible. Charles was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. The kind of consequences that would protect the monarchy's stability even if they require adjustments to current arrangements. Catherine felt a chill as she realized what Charles was implying. The experts had apparently discussed the possibility of removing or significantly limiting Camilla's role if the dysfunction continued. It was a nuclear option that would have devastating personal and public consequences. They're talking about removing me, Camilla said, her voice flat with shock. They're talking about stripping me of my position if I don't comply with these new arrangements. They're talking about protecting the institution, Charles corrected, though his tone suggested he found the recommendations as difficult as she did. They're talking about ensuring that personal conflicts don't compromise our ability to serve the public effectively. Catherine realized that this conversation had moved far beyond anything she had anticipated. What had started as a family discussion about boundaries and respect had evolved into a crisis that threatened the very foundations of Camilla's position within the monarchy. I never wanted it to come to this, Catherine said quietly. I never wanted our disagreements to escalate to the point where institutional changes became necessary. I just wanted to be able to function effectively within my own role, without constant interference. Camilla turned to look at Catherine with an expression that mixed hurt, anger, and something approaching desperation. And now you've gotten what you wanted, she said bitterly. You've successfully maneuvered me into a position where I have to choose between my principles and my position. That's not what happened, Catherine replied firmly. I didn't maneuver anyone into anything. I simply tried to fulfill my responsibilities despite systematic attempts to undermine my authority. The escalation to institutional measures wasn't my choice. It was the inevitable result of refusing to address these issues through normal family channels. Charles stepped in before the conversation could become more heated. No one maneuvered anyone, he said authoritatively. The situation escalated because informal attempts to resolve these conflicts were unsuccessful. When family discussions and gentle corrections don't work, institutional measures become necessary. Camilla stood up abruptly, beginning to pace again near the fireplace. So what are my options? She asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Accept these new limitations on my authority and essentially admit that I've been wrong about everything? Or refuse to comply and risk losing my position entirely? Your options, Charles said carefully, are to work within the new framework we've established or to continue patterns of behavior that have been deemed incompatible with effective family functioning. The choice is yours, but the consequences of that choice are now clearly defined. Catherine watched Camilla pace, feeling a mixture of sympathy and frustration. The Queen Consort was clearly struggling with the reality that her approach to family relationships had created a crisis that now threatened her position. But Catherine also recognized that this moment of reckoning had been inevitable given the escalating nature of their conflicts. I need to understand something, Camilla said suddenly, stopping her pacing to face Charles directly. Are you prepared to follow through on these threats? Are you really willing to damage our marriage and family relationships to support these new arrangements? Charles met her gaze steadily, and Catherine could see the pain in his eyes as he answered. I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to protect the monarchy and ensure effective family functioning. That includes making decisions that are personally difficult but institutionally necessary. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, their implications reverberating through the room. Catherine realized she was witnessing a moment that would define not just family relationships, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. You're asking me to fundamentally change who I am, Camilla said, her voice breaking slightly. You're asking me to give up the kind of active involvement and authority that I've fought so hard to achieve. You're asking me to step back and trust others to make decisions that I think are wrong. I'm asking you to respect boundaries, Charles replied. I'm asking you to exercise your legitimate authority effectively while respecting other family members' legitimate authority. I'm asking you to collaborate rather than control. Catherine could see that Camilla was approaching her own moment of decision. The queen consort could continue fighting these changes and risk the consequences Charles had outlined, or she could accept the new framework and try to work within it. Either choice would require significant personal sacrifice and adjustment. And if I agree to these changes, Camilla asked, what assurance do I have that I won't be gradually marginalized further? What guarantee do I have that this isn't just the first step in a process of removing my influence entirely? Charles considered this question carefully before responding. You have my word that your legitimate role and authority will be protected and respected within the new framework. You have assurance that these changes are designed to improve family functioning, not to punish or marginalize you personally. Your word, Camilla repeated thoughtfully. After this afternoon's revelations about what you've been observing and documenting, after discovering that you've been discussing my behavior with constitutional experts, your word doesn't carry quite the same weight it once did. Catherine could hear the hurt and betrayal in Camilla's voice, and she found herself feeling genuinely sorry for the position the queen consort was in. Despite their conflicts, Catherine had never wanted to see Camilla completely isolated or humiliated. Perhaps, Catherine suggested carefully, we could establish some kind of regular review process, a way to assess how the new arrangements are working and make adjustments if necessary. That might provide the kind of assurance you're looking for while ensuring that the changes actually improve our family dynamics. Camilla looked at Catherine with surprise, clearly not having expected such a constructive suggestion. A review process? Something formal but fair, Catherine explained. Regular meetings where we can honestly assess whether the new boundaries are working, whether communication has improved, whether everyone feels respected and valued within their proper roles. If the arrangements aren't working effectively, we could make adjustments. If they are working, we could build on that success. Charles nodded approvingly at this suggestion. That seems reasonable and fair. A way to ensure accountability for everyone involved while providing flexibility to address unforeseen issues. Catherine could see Camilla considering this proposal, weighing the benefits of having some ongoing input into how the new arrangements worked against the risks of accepting the fundamental changes to her authority. Who would conduct these reviews? Camilla asked. Who would make the determination about whether adjustments are needed? We would, Charles replied simply. The three of us, along with William when appropriate. These are family matters, and they should be resolved through family processes. The involvement of outside experts and formal protocols is only necessary when family processes fail. The grandfather clock chimed again, its sound now familiar and somewhat comforting as it marked the passage of this momentous day. Catherine realized that they were approaching the end of this lengthy confrontation, and the decisions made in the next few minutes would likely determine the course of their relationships for years to come. Camilla returned to her seat, her movements slower and more deliberate than they had been earlier in the day. When she spoke, her voice was quieter but more resolute than it had been since the conversation began. I don't like these changes, she said honestly. I don't like giving up authority that I believe I've earned and deserve. I don't like accepting limitations that feel arbitrary and punitive. But I understand that my alternative is potentially worse. Charles and Catherine waited silently for her to continue, both sensing that this was Camilla's final decision about how to proceed. I will accept the new arrangements, Camilla said finally. I will work within the boundaries that have been established and respect other family members' authority within their proper roles. But I want the review process Catherine suggested, and I want clear communication about expectations and standards going forward. Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her as Camilla made this commitment. While she knew that actually implementing these changes would be challenging, having Camilla's explicit agreement to try was a crucial first step. "Thank you," Charles said simply, and Catherine could hear the relief in his voice as well. "This is the right decision for all of us and for the institution we serve." As the day drew to a close, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary nature of what had just transpired. A family conflict that had been building for months had finally been addressed directly and decisively. Formal changes had been implemented to prevent future dysfunction. And, most importantly, all parties had committed to working within a new framework designed to respect everyone's legitimate roles while preventing the kind of interference and undermining that had created the crisis. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as they all attempted to implement these agreements in their daily interactions. But, for now, Catherine felt more optimistic about the family's future than she had in months. The confrontation had been painful and difficult, but it had also been necessary and ultimately productive. The foundations had been laid for healthier relationships and more effective collaboration going forward. 3 weeks had passed since that pivotal afternoon at Clarence's house, and Catherine found herself reflecting on how dramatically the atmosphere within the royal family had changed. The formal protocols that Charles had implemented were working better than anyone had dared to hope, but, more importantly, the underlying relationships seemed to be healing in ways that surprised everyone involved. The first test had come just days after their confrontation, when Charlotte had come down with a severe case of flu that required careful medical attention and adjustments to the family's public schedule. In the past, such a situation would have inevitably led to conflicting directives and behind-the-scenes maneuvering as different family members attempted to impose their preferences for how to handle the crisis. Instead, Catherine had been able to coordinate directly with William and their medical team to determine the best course of action, while keeping Charles and Camilla informed through appropriate channels without their interference in the decision-making process. When Camilla had offered to help by arranging additional medical consultations, she had done so through Catherine rather than going around her, and she had accepted Catherine's decision to decline the additional consultations without argument or resentment. The incident had demonstrated that the new boundaries could work even under stress, and it had given everyone confidence that the agreements they had reached were practically workable rather than merely theoretical. William had returned from Scotland to find a family dynamic that was noticeably different from what he had left behind. Catherine had briefed him carefully about the confrontation and its outcomes, and his reaction had been one of relief mixed with amazement that such deep-seated issues had finally been addressed so directly. "I knew there were problems," he had told Catherine privately, "but I had no idea how systematic they had become or how much stress you were carrying because of them. I should have been more aware, should have been more supportive in addressing these issues earlier." Catherine had reassured him that the timing had actually been perfect. Charles had needed to reach his own conclusions about the seriousness of the situation, and Camilla had needed to understand the institutional implications of her behavior before any meaningful change could occur. Earlier intervention might have been seen as ganging up on Camilla rather than addressing legitimate family governance issues. The new weekly family meetings that Catherine had suggested were proving to be unexpectedly valuable. Rather than the formal, confrontational sessions that everyone had feared, they had evolved into genuine opportunities for coordination and collaboration. Camilla's contributions to these discussions were thoughtful and constructive, and she seemed to be genuinely embracing the role of advisor rather than controller. During the most recent meeting, Camilla had raised concerns about the security arrangements for an upcoming public event, and her suggestions had led to important improvements in the planning process. Rather than trying to override existing arrangements or implement changes unilaterally, she had worked through proper channels and had accepted the ultimate decision-making authority of the people responsible for security coordination. "I'm actually enjoying these meetings," Camilla had admitted to Catherine after one particularly productive session. "There's something liberating about being able to share my thoughts and concerns without feeling like I have to fight for every point or worry about whether my input will be taken seriously." Catherine had been surprised by this admission, but it reflected a broader change in Camilla's approach to family relationships. The Queen Consort seemed more relaxed, less defensive, and paradoxically more influential now that she wasn't trying to control every aspect of family functioning. The public had begun to notice the change in family dynamics as well. Royal watchers and media commentators had remarked on the smoother coordination of public appearances, the more natural interactions between family members at official events, and the general sense that the royal family was functioning more effectively as a team. "There's something different about them lately," one longtime royal correspondent had written. They seem more comfortable with each other, more genuinely collaborative. Whatever internal adjustments they've made seem to be working well. Catherine found herself thinking often about that crucial moment in the drawing room when Camilla had finally agreed to accept the new arrangements. She had expected that agreement to be grudging and temporary, but instead it seemed to have opened the door to genuine improvement in their relationship. Just the previous week, Camilla had sought Catherine out for a private conversation about planning for George's upcoming milestone birthday. Rather than presenting a fully formed plan and expecting Catherine to accept it, Camilla had come with thoughtful suggestions and genuine questions about Catherine's preferences and priorities. "I know I haven't always approached these situations in the best way," Camilla had said during that conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about our discussion that day, and I realized that my desire to be helpful sometimes came across as controlling or dismissive of your judgment." Catherine had appreciated both the acknowledgement and the obvious effort Camilla was making to change her approach. "I think we all learned important things about communication and boundaries," she had replied diplomatically. "The important thing is that we're moving forward more constructively." But perhaps the most significant change had been in Charles himself. The stress and tension that had been evident in his demeanor for months had lifted, and he seemed to have found a new confidence in his leadership of the family. The decisive action he had taken to address the dysfunction had apparently been as liberating for him as it had been for Catherine. "I should have acted sooner," he had told Catherine during a recent private conversation. "I should have recognized how serious these issues had become and addressed them before they reached crisis proportions." Leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions about personal relationships, and I had been avoiding that responsibility. Catherine had disagreed with his self-criticism. "The timing was actually important," she had told him. "If you had acted earlier, it might have seemed like an overreaction or favoritism." By allowing the situation to develop to the point where institutional concerns were raised, you made it clear that the changes were necessary for the monarchy's effectiveness rather than personal preferences. The conversation had revealed another important aspect of the changes that had occurred. Charles had gained confidence not just in managing family relationships, but in making difficult leadership decisions more generally. The skills he had developed in addressing the family crisis were serving him well in other aspects of his role as king. The quarterly review session that Catherine had suggested was approaching, and she found herself cautiously optimistic about what it would reveal. All the evidence suggested that the new arrangements were working well for everyone involved, but the formal review would provide an opportunity to assess progress systematically and make any needed adjustments. Camilla had expressed some nervousness about the review, apparently worried that any remaining areas of disagreement or adjustment might be seen as evidence that she wasn't successfully adapting to the new arrangements. Catherine had reassured her that the goal of the review was improvement rather than evaluation, and that honest feedback about what was and wasn't working would be valued rather than criticized. "The fact that we can have these conversations openly and constructively is actually evidence that the changes are working," Catherine had pointed out. "A year ago, none of us would have felt comfortable discussing these issues so directly." The review meeting was scheduled to take place in the same drawing room where the original confrontation had occurred, a choice that Charles had made deliberately to emphasize how far they had all come in their ability to address difficult issues constructively. As the date approached, Catherine found herself reflecting on the broader lessons she had learned from this experience. The importance of addressing problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. The value of clear boundaries and well-defined roles in preventing conflicts. The power of institutional structures to support healthy relationships rather than simply constraining harmful behavior. But, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that even deeply entrenched patterns of dysfunction could be changed when all parties were willing to acknowledge problems honestly and commit to different approaches. The transformation in her relationship with Camilla had been more dramatic and positive than she would have thought possible just months earlier. The evening before the review meeting, Catherine received an unexpected phone call from Camilla, who wanted to discuss her thoughts about how the new arrangements had been working. "I've been thinking about what I want to say tomorrow," Camilla had begun. "I want to be honest about the challenges I've faced in adjusting to the new approach, but I also want to acknowledge how much better things have become for all of us." They had talked for nearly an hour about specific examples of improved communication, more effective collaboration, and better outcomes for the family's public and private responsibilities. By the end of the conversation, Catherine felt more confident than ever that the review meeting would be productive and positive. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a welcome change from the stormy weather that had marked their original confrontation. As Catherine made her way to Clarence's house for the review meeting, she felt a sense of anticipation rather than the dread that had characterized her arrival 3 weeks earlier. The same drawing room looked different somehow, brighter, more welcoming, less charged with tension. Charles and Camilla were already there when she arrived, and the atmosphere was notably relaxed and constructive. "Thank you both for being here," Charles began, his tone warm rather than formal. "I think we all recognize how much has changed since we last sat in this room together, and today gives us an opportunity to assess our progress and plan for continued improvement." Camilla spoke first, her voice steady and thoughtful. "I want to begin by acknowledging how difficult it was for me to accept the changes we discussed," she said honestly. "My initial reaction was defensive and resistant, and I wasn't immediately able to see how the new arrangements could benefit all of us." Catherine appreciated Camilla's honesty about her initial reactions, and she could see Charles nodding approvingly as his wife continued. "But these past 3 weeks have shown me that collaboration is actually more effective than control," Camilla continued. "I've been able to contribute meaningfully to family decisions while respecting other people's authority, and the results have been better than anything I could have achieved through the old approach." Catherine felt a surge of genuine warmth toward Camilla as she listened to this reflection. The Queen Consort's willingness to acknowledge not just the success of the new arrangements but her own growth in adapting to them was both humble and encouraging. "I've learned some important things as well," Catherine said when it was her turn to speak. "I've learned that many of our conflicts were based on misunderstandings about roles and responsibilities rather than fundamental disagreements about goals. I've also learned that addressing problems directly, even when it's uncomfortable, leads to much better outcomes than trying to work around them." Charles smiled at both women before offering his own assessment. "What strikes me most about these past few weeks is how much more effective we've all become," he said. "Not just in avoiding conflicts, but in accomplishing our shared goals. The clearer boundaries and better communication have made us stronger as individuals and as a family." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering specific examples of improved collaboration, areas where further refinement might be helpful, and plans for maintaining the positive momentum they had created. By the end of the meeting, all three of them were smiling and clearly pleased with how far they had come. As they prepared to leave, Camilla approached Catherine with an expression of genuine warmth. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "Not just for the specific conflicts we had, but for not recognizing sooner how capable and dedicated you are. I allowed my own insecurities to cloud my judgment about your character and contributions." Catherine was moved by this admission, and she found herself responding with equal honesty. "I owe you an apology as well," she said. "I should have tried harder to understand your perspective and find ways to work with you rather than around you. I should have recognized that some of our conflicts were based on misunderstandings that could have been resolved through better communication." Charles watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased to see his wife and daughter-in-law finding genuine common ground. "This is what I had hoped would happen," he said warmly. "Not just the resolution of conflicts, but the development of real understanding and mutual respect." As they left Clarence's house that afternoon, Catherine reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred. What had begun as a crisis threatening the stability of the royal family had evolved into an opportunity for growth, improvement, and stronger relationships. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about leadership, communication, and the importance of addressing problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. But, perhaps most importantly, it had shown her that even the most challenging family dynamics could be transformed when all parties were willing to approach them with honesty, humility, and a commitment to constructive change. The weeks and months that followed continued to demonstrate the lasting impact of that crucial confrontation. The royal family operated more smoothly and effectively than it had in years, with clear roles, respectful communication, and genuine collaboration characterizing their interactions both in private and in public. Catherine often thought about that stormy afternoon when Charles had finally spoken up for her, when Camilla's shouts had indeed faded into silence, and when all of them had committed to a better way forward. It had been a difficult and emotionally challenging experience, but it had ultimately strengthened their family in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The monarchy was stronger because of the changes they had made, the public was better served by their improved effectiveness, and the children were growing up in a family environment characterized by respect, cooperation, and clear boundaries rather than conflict and confusion. Most importantly, Catherine had learned that she didn't have to accept dysfunction or inappropriate behavior simply to maintain peace. Sometimes the most loving thing to do for a family was to insist on standards and boundaries that allowed everyone to thrive within their proper roles. As she looked toward the future, Catherine felt confident that the foundations they had built would serve the royal family well for generations to come. The confrontation that had seemed so threatening at the time had ultimately become the catalyst for positive change that strengthened every aspect of their shared responsibilities. The drawing room at Clarence's house continued to serve as a venue for regular family meetings, but its atmosphere had been permanently transformed from a place of confrontation to a space of collaboration. The grandfather clock still marked the passage of time with its steady rhythm, but now it seemed to count moments of progress and growth rather than tension and conflict. In the end, Charles's decision to finally speak up had indeed created a moment of silence, not the silence of defeat or suppression, but the silence of understanding, acceptance, and a new beginning. It was in that silence that the real work of rebuilding had begun, and from which a stronger, more unified royal family had emerged.